If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Hello and welcome to Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what's called dynamic risk assessments. Now, many people have heard of what a risk assessment is, but a dynamic risk assessment is an ongoing, in-the-moment risk assessment. A very simple example of this is like crossing a road. We have a pre-written risk assessment called the Green Cross Code, but until you get to that road and see how busy it is, what the weather conditions are like, whether you're walking with your elderly grandmother on your own, it'll change what you do. And that's the dynamic aspect. If any of you out there have ever done first aid training, the first thing we always check for in every first aid scenario is danger. And that's, is there a danger to us or anybody else? That's your dynamic risk assessment. But like any technique, there is skills to it. There is things needed. And a lot of organizations sometimes do a dynamic risk assessment in their kind of care plans and risk assessments. They haven't necessarily taught anybody to do them. So for any of you out there watching this, let me just explain how we do a dynamic risk assessment, why it's important. We need an element of situation awareness, just like the first aid scenario. If I'm running into a situation, but what if they've been electrocuted or what if they've asphyxiated due to gas in the room and I go running in to help them, then I'm leaving myself extremely vulnerable, which means I may not be able to help them. We have to always remember that we have a primary duty of care to ourselves above anybody else. Because if we're not okay, how can we help anybody else to be okay? This is why a general rule I work on is to be truly selfless. You have to first be selfish. When we're dealing with complex behaviors and difficult behaviors, that's where, again, dynamic risk assessments are massively important. Because am I leaving myself vulnerable to any physical harm if I go rushing into this situation? So when we're looking at dynamic risk assessments, there's 3 types of dynamic risk assessment that we should be doing. The first one is ideally a proactive dynamic risk assessment. If I get called to a situation or if I hear distress in the other room, before I go rushing into that room, I may need to be thinking about what do I already know? What do I know about the space I'm about to go into? Is there a limited amount of room? So I'm going to give you an acronym that we use. It's called APOP. And APOP stands for activity, people, object, place. So if I'm about to go into a situation, I need to be thinking about those 4 elements: activity, people, objects, place. If I know anything about the person I'm going in to support, have a conversation with, do I know anything about the environment itself, the room? How big is it? What's the layout like? Is there anything that might block my path? Do I need to be thinking about where the exits are? Objects could be anything in that room that could potentially cause me harm, like weapons or furniture or anything like that. Okay. And the first one, though, is activity. What am I going in to do? So if I hear distress, I may be going in, I might have to deal with a first aid incident, or I might have to deal with some level of agitated or aggressive behavior. So should I be going in on my own before I get to the situation? The people is, what do I know about this person? Have they got a history of aggressive behavior? Or do they lash out? Do they struggle with communication? Do they struggle with emotional regulation? Are they bigger, stronger, faster than I am? All things I have to consider as far as the vulnerability and the risk to me. object could be, have they got anything in their hand that could be used as a weapon? Is there anything in the close proximity to them that could be used as a weapon? Okay. Has they got any history? Again, going back to people, have they got a history of using weapons? The last one is place. Have I got colleagues available? Where's my route out of this room? Is there things that are blocking my path? Is there things that I could fall over? So there's a lot to think about in that moment. And this is the proximity when I'm engaging with the individual. And that's the same as, say, where the first date, crossing the road, even things like moving and handling. We should be doing this kind of same process for. The third range is not just being aware of what's directly in front of you. Is there anything in their room that they could go over to that and grab that as a potential weapon? There is that other individual that we support that seems to be getting agitated and distressed within this situation that I need to be mindful of. My exit is the doors closing behind me. My colleague is the other end of the home. So as well as the pre and as well as the close proxemics, we've got that secondary range, which I'm also being aware of the kind of the bigger picture. Now, all three of those we should be utilizing, thinking about with any situation. Okay, so let me give you an example. You have been asked to go and deliver some bad news to a particular individual. This individual has a history of aggressive behavior. They struggle with changes in routine or changes in circumstances. You have a fairly positive relationship with them, but they have been confrontational with you in the past. They're 6'3". They're quite athletic, and they're currently in their bedroom. And you've been asked to go and deliver that bad news on your own. So what factors have we got there as far as dynamic risk assessment? Well, the first one is I'm on my own. I'm lone working. So is that safe? Now, we said we've got a positive relationship with them, but that's not a great relationship. And now what would work on the flip side is if I didn't have a good relationship with them, that would definitely be a box on the seesaw of risk. Okay. So it'd be something that would increase the risk slightly. The fact that they're 6'3" and athletic means there's a higher vulnerability to me. So if they were, let's say, immobile or bedbound, for instance, then that would change the level of risk. It reminds me of a situation I read in the news, actually, where a police officer ended up tasering an elderly gentleman with dementia who was in a wheelchair. And it feels like a little bit of that was some poor risk assessment going on there as far as why didn't they just create the space and move away? Why did they feel that was an appropriate course of action? So again, you can think of if somebody's bedbound, I might feel more comfortable to go in and deliver the bad news in that environment because maybe they're not going to be able to get to me. If it escalates, I've still got a way out. We'd also think about if it's their bedroom, is there clutter in there? Is there anything on the floor? Is there anything? And knowing the person, knowing their bedroom could be a factor of that. But the bedroom might be a safe space for them anyway. And therefore, is that the best place to do it? Especially as there's only one way in and one way out. And the place itself, maybe their bedroom is the first door at the top of the stairs, and therefore there's an increased vulnerability. Maybe it's all the way, it's on the third floor, and my only colleague is currently down on the first floor. Now, the whole idea of the dynamic risk assessment is we can never eliminate or reduce risk completely. We're looking to reduce it to a reasonable level. We need to kind of do our best to make sure that we stay safe. Because as I said, if anything happens to us, who's going to look after that person tomorrow? Who's going to support them? Now, dynamic risk assessment is not something we do it instinctively to some degree, like crossing a road, but only when we've got that experience, only when we've got that knowledge. So it does kind of, it's a habit that needs to be developed. And how long you've got to do that risk assessment sometimes is it's ongoing, it's split second, but obviously practicing it, thinking about it, considering it is something that's really important. Now, some of you who are listening and watching this and stuff may not feel it's particularly applicable. But if you were a teacher, if you were a caregiver, if you were a parent, if you're anybody, because even there is many parents out there who do suffer child-related violence where, unfortunately, because their child struggles with emotional regulation and difficulties, the child will lash out. And it's every parent's instinct at times to go rushing in and to try and help and support. And I completely understand that. This is why in other podcasts I refer to the importance of responding rather than reacting. That instinct to care, instinct to protect, instinct to kind of keep them safe may put you at danger. And if you're in danger, then who's going to look after them later, or what could be the repercussions of that? A good analogy for thinking about your dynamic risk assessment is putting yourself first is the mask on an airplane. When a mask drops down an airplane, you don't help the child first, you have to help yourself first. And that's for exactly the same reasons that I encourage you to do your dynamic risk assessment. So just to reiterate those four elements that we should be referring to: activity, people, object, and place are the four elements we should be considering that are all what we call impact factors that affect the level of risk. And the more impact factors we have, the higher the risk, and therefore can we reduce the risk to a lower level in another way by changing the environment, changing the number of people, creating space or distance, finding another alternative way of doing this or communicating, for instance. The last bit I'd kind of refer to is obviously you've got the three ranges. The more you can do of this in advance of the situation, the better, because it allows you to prepare and approach it in a safe way. On the flip side, it's a case of sometimes we have to deal with that in a moment. It's a more responsive strategy. And just to finish off with one final example that I use most commonly, would you say no to somebody with severe mental health challenges and history of aggressive behavior next to an open knife drawer? Now, caveat. Most people with mental health are far more likely to hurt themselves than anybody else. But if there is a history of aggressive behavior, we know that no is a potential trigger word, then no is going to be a bad thing to say if there is weapons right in proximity. Now, it doesn't mean the carer should then close the drawer and say no. They may just go, tell you what, let me just get things tidied up in here and we'll go to the other room and see what we can sort out for you. Because the internal monologue should be, I'm in a vulnerable position. You're blocking my exit. There is weapons available. I know that no's a trigger word. You've got a history of aggressive behavior. You have there's quite an intimidating shadow in the fact that you're quite big, quite strong. I don't have a colleague available to me, and I've got a limited amount of space to be able to move. All of those factors should mean maybe now and this place is not the right time to do this. So allowing us to respond rather than react, we can then remove ourselves from that situation, and we might go into the other room and say no in there, but maybe we've got a bit more room to be able to do it. I'll give you one final example of this, actually. It was a home that I worked with. They had a wonderful example. It was a young lad who did have a history of aggressive behavior. And they had to confiscate an item that he'd bought. He bought himself a bracelet that had all these spikes on it, and they'd risk assessed and felt it was potentially a risk to him and others, and maybe that it wasn't appropriate for him to have it within the home. So they removed this item. Now, when he got back from college, they knew they needed to tell him that they'd removed it and were initiating this kind of rule. But they knew that would cause significant distress and agitation and anger, and therefore probably he would go into a state where he would become physically aggressive. Now, 95% of people would rather run away than fight. So if I'm in a small room, though, and I feel like a caught animal, I'm far more likely to attack rather than to run. So rather than doing it in the lounge where they usually have these conversations, they said, hey, do you fancy going down the park and kicking around a football for a bit? They went down the park, they found a big field, and they told him in there. Because in one way, that gave them room to run away, but it also gave him room to run. It gave him, because it's far harder to kind of run across a field and punch somebody in the face to have that level of intent than it is to just kind of lash out at somebody within a room. So by creating more space, by moving out of that scenario in the situation, they reduce the risks in themselves, but they could still instigate that plan, that process. Okay. Hopefully you found that useful. Thanks for listening. Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description.